Good afternoon, and welcome to another in our series of webinars on pathways to a decarbonized economy and a more livable planet. My name is Todd Eisenstadt. I'm a professor in the School of Public Affairs at American University, and on behalf of the Center for Environmental Policy, it's a pleasure to welcome you to a discussion today which is extremely timely, especially given that there is a virtual summit being led by the US White House regarding climate change today, and that today is Earth Day. So welcome. And today's discussion is assessing the costs of climate change mitigation and the cost of falling short. We have a really spectacular group of panelists today, and I'm going to introduce the moderator, Paul Bugala, who has worked for more than 15 years as an oil mining and timber investment and ESG analyst at Calvert Investments, which is now a subsidiary of Morgan Stanley. He's worked at Oxfam and as an independent investment analyst. He's also taught a sustainable finance course in the MBA program at George Washington University's School of Business. And most importantly, he's on the advisory board of the American University Center for Environmental Policy. He's also a member of Amnesty International USA's Business and Human Rights Group. We are really proud and thankful to Paul Bugala for joining us to moderate this discussion. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Todd, and thank you, Dan Fiorino, as well, for the invitation to participate in this really, as Todd mentioned, excellent panel. Today's panel, as Todd mentioned, is titled Assessing the Costs of Climate Change Mitigation and the Costs of Falling Short. And we have an excellent panel, including Helen Mountford of the World Resources Institute, Paul Bledsoe of American University, the Progressive Policy Institute, and Bledsoe Associates, Kevin Rennert of Resources for the Future, and Mary Boyer of the World Bank. We will start our discussion by speaking in the most concrete terms possible about the economic costs and benefits of addressing climate change. And then we will pivot to the strategies necessary to limit climate impacts, explore the social costs of carbon and policy analysis, and finally take a deeper dive into the risks and costs of climate change with a specific case focused on the Caribbean. Of course, our panelist discussion will be followed by plenty of time for Q&A when you will have the opportunity to engage with this really excellent panel on these critical issues. We look forward to that. So to start off though, in my little corner of the world, the financial services industry has been through a climate change mitigation reckoning. Internationally, that has included the creation of the Network for Greening the Financial System, which was founded in 2015, in which the Fed just joined, and the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, which, just to cite two examples. And of course, the US federal government has also begun several finance-related climate mitigation efforts. The US government efforts, as Todd mentioned today, are most notably include President Biden's announcement of a new target for the US to achieve a 50 to 52% reduction in 2005 levels of economy-wide net greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. But also importantly, in March, then acting SEC Chair Allison Lee announced a comment period for a 90-day comment period for climate risk disclosure requirements. Of course, the Fed, the Department of Treasury, and other agencies have undertaken their own climate mitigation efforts as well. But focusing on the SEC, its mission to protect investors, maintain fair, orderly, and efficient markets, and facilitate capital formation depends on providing the information necessary for market participants to make sound investment decisions. And without reliable climate-related financial information, securities markets can't price climate-related risk and opportunities correctly and may potentially face a rocky transition in a low carbon economy with sudden value shifts and destabilizing costs if industries must rapidly adjust to a new landscape. Also, if one assumes the implementation of an economy-wide price on carbon, you can argue that the SEC is obligated to provide market participants with the information necessary to reflect its impact on investment decision-making, regardless of an investor's access to private data sources or company management. So thankfully, Senator Elizabeth Warren and Congressman Sean Casten recognized all this when they introduced the Climate Risk Disclosure Act in 2019. This bill was reintroduced last week and includes a variety of important reforms to climate-related disclosures required under that would be required under Section 13 of the Securities Exchange Act. However, one that is particularly critical to climate mitigation and our discussion today, I think, in my estimation, is the bill's provision that requires companies registered with the SEC to disclose the potential amount of direct and indirect greenhouse gas emissions that are embedded in proven and probable hydrocarbon reserves. This proposal is very consistent with work I did at Calvert Investments, applying IPCC, or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, effective CO2 emissions factors to the reserves of oil and gas companies to come up with a means to quantify their climate risk exposure. The result of this calculation is effectively an estimation of each oil and gas company's scope 3 CO2 emissions. And making this information available through annual disclosures like 10K statements will provide investors with a powerful, forward-looking, consistent, and comparable data point. This information will not only enable investors to properly price climate risk in the oil sector, but also form the basis for broader estimations of the impact of climate risk in other sectors, especially banking. So meaningful mitigation of climate risk will take countless efforts, like translating fossil fuel reserves into future CO2 emissions, and balancing the costs and benefits of climate mitigation efforts will require thorough sector-specific analysis and action that will necessitate the time and talent of countless experts from a broad array of fields. But we can't let the enormity or complexity of that task discourage us from taking it on, as this is an existential challenge, and falling short simply isn't an option. And today we have the privilege to spend some time with some of the experts from those variety of fields I mentioned, who haven't let the gravity of the task of climate mitigation deter them. And I know we're looking forward to hearing from them. So first, I will turn to Helen Mountford of the World Resources Institute. Helen, can you join us?
Hi, Paul. Thanks very much.
Hi, thanks for joining us. Helen is the Vice President for Climate and Economics at WRI. The climate team there helps policymakers, businesses, and civil society internationally, and collaborates to identify and advance the deep structural shifts needed to successfully address climate change. Helen is also the director of the new Climate Economy Project, the flagship initiative of the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate that provides independent and authoritative evidence on actions which can both strengthen economic performance and reduce the risk of dangerous climate change. Helen previously worked as the Deputy Director of Environment for the OECD, of course, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, advising governments on policy reforms and overseeing work on green fiscal reform, climate change finance, economics, fossil fuel subsidy reforms, biodiversity, biodiversity incentive measures. So we're very fortunate to have Helen with us today, and she is going to talk to us about the economic and social benefits of addressing climate change. I will pass it on to you.
Thank you so much, Paul. And I'm just going to try and share my screen here so that you can see a couple of slides I've got on some of these developments. Can I check with somebody? Are you able to see my screen now? I'm hoping
yes, we can.
That is up. Perfect. Thank you so much. So Paul, actually, I think my comments really follow very nicely on yours. There's three things I want to emphasize today. One is just what we're seeing even in the midst of a global pandemic and an economic recession, the likes of which we haven't seen for a very long time, even during this period, we're actually seeing countries, companies, investors step up and adopt net zero targets and more ambitious 2030 targets as well. So one, some of the momentum we're seeing partly because it's being seen as what is absolutely essential and what is needed for the economy and society going forward. We need this kind of climate action. So one, that. Two, I'd like to just unpick a little bit what's actually been happening in the COVID response measures, where we've seen some progress and where we've actually seen some things going not towards the green, low carbon economy, but more towards the dirty, old economy of the past. And then third, just to give a very concrete example of some of the economic and development benefits we see from some very recent work we've been doing with the Indonesian government. So let me just briefly start off by just saying, how much momentum we're seeing around the world today. At the moment, we've got 48 parties, and it's actually 59 countries, including the European Union countries, 59 countries representing over 54% of global emissions that have committed to net zero targets. A number more than this have signaled that they're likely to go to net zero. So by some counts, it's many, many more but at least 50% of countries have done so. Most of those commitments have come forward in the last 1 to 2 years. So again, even during the midst of a global pandemic, we're getting these commitments coming forward. If these are all delivered, according to analysis by the Climate Action Tracker, if these are all delivered, we will actually shift the needle on climate impacts from the current trajectory, which is closer to a sort of 2.9 degrees Celsius global warming, to something closer to 2.1 degrees Celsius. That's not enough. We want to get closer to 1.5 C if at all possible, but it would be a shift in the needle. Now, the challenge is this needs to be backed up. To be credible, all of these net zero targets need to be backed up by clear pathways to get there, 2030 targets, the enhanced NDCs, and we've seen exciting developments today, the US coming forward, as you mentioned, Paul, with a new commitment to reduce their emissions by 50 to 52% by 2030. We had Japan come forward this morning saying they will reduce theirs by 46%, but striving towards 50% by 2030. Canada announced a slightly less ambitious target, 40 to 45%, but that was still a significant increase on where they were before, almost doubling their previous Paris target. So we need these net zero commitments to be backed up by the intermediary targets. We need the business and finance sector to move and support this. And also we need to ensure that we're locking this in at the moment as we do the economic recoveries. So in terms of business action, in terms of what we're seeing, just briefly, we already have over 1,300 companies that have committed to set their own science-based targets with trajectories, with intermediate points saying how they're going to actually achieve those targets over time. That represents $15.4 trillion in terms of market value. So quite significant there from the company side, and more coming forward basically every day. I'm pretty sure by the end of today with the Leaders Climate Summit, we're going to have a lot more on that list. In addition to that, we just had launched 2 days ago, I believe now, losing track of time this week. It's been a crazy week. 2 days ago now, we had the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero just launched. And this actually brings together the asset owners, the asset managers, the banks that are all starting to commit to net zero emissions in their portfolios by 2050. So over 160 signatories, it's over 70 trillion in assets globally. And partly to some of the points that you were raising, Paul, it's also very much focused on using science-based guidelines. Sorry, this is so new, I've got a typo in the slide. Such new, exciting news. Science-based guidelines to reach net zero, covers all scopes, includes these 2030 interim targets, and committed very much to transparent reporting and accountability, very much, we hope, aligned with the recommendations of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. So there's quite a bit of movement there. It's nowhere near enough, but a lot that's actually coming forward. As I said, that's the sort of net zero targets. That's also what we're starting to see in terms of 2030 targets, the pathways to actually get to those net zero targets, starting to come forward, less on the pathways yet. We still have quite a few major economies. Both China and South Korea, for example, have net zero targets, but haven't yet locked in what that means in terms of 2030, looking to them to do so. But good announcements, some good announcements this morning already from a few other major economies. So more to go. The next stage is, are they actually building it into what they're doing today? And part of that is really around the COVID economic recovery. And what this slide shows is from our colleagues at Vivid Economics. It shows for each of these countries for the parts of their stimulus bills and their efforts so far in COVID recovery, how much has actually been green versus how much has been dirty. So for the majority of these, 70% or so of the stimulus has actually had nothing to do with environment. It's really about that immediate health and financial assistance to households and to others to actually keep going during these difficult times and to tackle COVID. But there is 30% that's environmentally relevant. And what you'll see here is that for quite a few of them, it's actually been quite negative in terms of the contribution to climate and environment. It's been quite dirty. There's some that are greener. You'll see the gray bars are where it's negative. The green bars are where it's cleaner. The positive sign is coming in this table. Where you see the arrows that are green, that is where over time, over this last year, as we've been tracking them, they've actually shifted towards greener and greener stimulus. So for quite a few countries, you've seen that move, and you're going to see even more in the US once some of the recent proposals by President Biden come through. That will significantly shift in the US. But the point of these are really that what we've actually been seeing is that while in the very early stages of the COVID response, what we had was a lot of bailouts of fossil fuel industries, that sort of knee-jerk reaction to support the aviation industry, the oil and gas industries, the maritime shipping, et cetera. What's actually happened more recently is they've recognized that there's real opportunities from moving towards a greener stimulus and a green economy. And part of that is highlighted here. What we've seen from a number of studies is that actually investing in solar photovoltaics, other types of renewable energy, building efficiency, urban transport infrastructure that includes in particular public transport or walkways and bike paths. What's not on this chart, but I'll mention restoring degraded agricultural lands. All of these, for the same amount of investment, can produce double or more the amount of jobs that you would get from investing in coal, in gas, or in oil. So as an economy, as a country, as you're looking to make investments to stimulate, to boost the economy coming out, investing in these clean energy, clean transport, and land use-based solutions are actually going to boost jobs in the immediate term. They're going to deliver jobs across the country. We need building efficiency everywhere there is a town or city or a building. Rural, the land use solutions are going to be incredibly important. So you'll get jobs everywhere. And it will also lead to a cleaner, more resilient, and more sustainable economy, the economy of the future. So we're starting to see that. This I'll just share briefly as a slide, which really kind of highlights a study that was done early last spring, where they interviewed, this was a team that interviewed a number of leads from finance ministries, from central banks, from others, and said, you know, what's going to lead to the best multiplier effects, the economic benefits of investments as we do the recovery, and how does this align with climate? So what you'll see here is some of the things that were done very early on in the COVID response, including things like, you know, airline bailouts or support for large corporations. Those are down in that bottom left corner, which really show that they don't have good economic multipliers over the long run, and they have a negative environmental effect. And then other things up in the top right corner, that's where we've started to see more coming forward in terms of clean energy infrastructure, building upgrades, clean R&D spending. So there's a lot of evidence that's been coming forward, and quite a few countries have been starting to shift. Now, I wanted to share with you very briefly an example, which is from Indonesia, where we've been working with the Ministry of Planning there for a number of years. They had been tasked to actually develop the last 5-year economic development plan, the 2020 to 2024 RPJMN. It's called their economic development plan, and they were asked to do that in a way that was green. And so they've been looking at how to do this, and I'll share with you in a moment just a slide from some of that work. what they are very aware of, Indonesia is one of the countries, many countries are, but they're very much on the front lines of climate impacts. They've had a number of natural disasters. And this slide is just kind of showing how some of those impacts are hitting Indonesia already today and where they'll be in the future. Now, the work that they have done, and we supported them on, really identified what could be a low carbon development pathway for Indonesia. What might this look like in terms of not just emissions, but also employment, economic health benefits, etc. And what they found is that reducing emissions by 43% by 2030, which is significantly above their current Paris Agreement target, would actually lead to better growth than business as usual growth. This was back in 2019. We found that between now and 2045, which is when Indonesia hits its 100-year independence, could have GDP growth of about 6% per year, could lead to significant additional jobs from the very first year compared to business as usual, would lead to 40,000 fewer deaths from air pollution by 2045, would also help to reduce poverty much more quickly and close the gender gap and some of the regional gaps. So important results. Difficult to get traction across government on all of this. Bits of this have been moving forward, but it's been slow as they've been trying to look at how to achieve this, what's the investments needed, how are they going to gain those, and what's going to come forward in terms of actions in each of the different sectors. Then, of course, COVID hit. COVID-19 hit, threw everything out, threw out all the economic projections for the country. So what they've been doing is rapidly rerunning these analyses, looking at how does this shift when you take into consideration the economic realities of COVID-19 last year and continuing on this year, and what might be some potential trajectories to actually get to net zero, jumping onto this net zero bandwagon that so many countries have come on. And on Tuesday this week, the Minister of Planning shared these slides, a very new, very initial analysis, but important, where they looked at a range of different net zero scenarios for Indonesia, from 2070 to actually 2045, getting to net zero by 2045, and a few stops in between. These are some of the policies that they looked at in terms of what could actually concretely be achieved to reach these. And one of the important things is this slide, which actually shows you why they are so interested in this and wanting to grasp it. What you can see here is the GDP growth between 2021 and 2045 for these different net zero scenarios. The scenario which is the most ambitious, the one that would get to net zero by 2045, is that green line at the top. It's going to be the best one economically for Indonesia. And while you can't see that clearly, the early years, sort of 2022, 2023, from this slide, if you zoom in up towards the top, there are the net zero 2045 and the net zero 2050 targets. They're already doing better in the first years than the current business as usual and baseline, and also some of the other scenarios. So there's a lot of challenges still to put anything like this in place. Right? How do you actually put in place the right sectors? It does require more investment and finance up front. How do you attract that, bring that into the economy? But the opportunities are there, and they'll be rerunning and continuing the simulations, looking more at what this means in terms of job benefits, gender benefits, health benefits, etc. But it's already very clear that an even more ambitious path would actually be better for the economy, for the society, and for development there. And Indonesia is not alone. We've seen this in many other countries, but because these were such exciting new results, I wanted to share them with you here today. So thank you, Paul. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen. There was a lot of really interesting points to wrestle with there. Particularly, I heard your points about the impact that net zero commitments, both by countries and companies, are having significant impacts on the path we see towards a climate mitigation, a sustainable climate mitigation future. And then the COVID recovery's impact on environmental and climate impacts. And then the incentives of investing in a green economy. And finally, a really compelling discussion about the climate change and its impact on development in Indonesia. I hope we get a chance to explore all those more in our Q&A. Thank you for sharing all that. And as a reminder to everyone, as we're going through, if you'd like to enter your questions in the Q&A, please do. And at the end, we as a group will address those as we can. So thank you again, Helen. And I'm going to pivot now over to Paul Bledsoe. Paul, can you join us? There you are. Paul Bledsoe is an adjunct professorial lecturer at the AU Center for Environmental Policy, an energy fellow and strategic advisor at the Progressive Policy Institute, and president of Bledsoe Associates, LLC, a strategic public policy firm specializing in energy, natural resources, and climate change, among other things. He was director of communications of the White House Climate Change Task Force under President Clinton from 1998 to 2001, communications director for the Senate Finance Committee under former Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and special assistant to former Interior Secretary Bruce Babbitt. Previously, he worked in legislative and communication posts in the U.S. House of Representatives, and his writing has appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, Financial Times, Politico, and other leading outlets. Paul is here to talk to us about separate strategies for limiting climate impacts and preventing tipping points. And with that, I will hand it off to him. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Paul. And thank you for everybody joining us today. I want to talk about the other climate forcers, the other greenhouse gases other than CO2. There's a tendency to lump all greenhouse gases under CO2. Actually, CO2 is probably somewhere between 30 to 35% of total emissions is not CO2. So CO2 is about 65% of global warming. And I want to talk about those other pollutants because they stay in the atmosphere a much shorter period of time than CO2. So if we cut them quickly, we may be able to reduce near-term temperatures more effectively. So let me share very quickly a PowerPoint on this. So let's get right to it. Leading studies are finding that fast rising temperatures in just the next 10 years may trigger tipping points in the natural systems that may undermine our abilities to control climate change. These natural systems include Arctic sea ice, Siberia tundra, the Amazon, ocean currents, and many others. And the problem is that if temperatures are allowed to rise above 1.5 Celsius pre-industrial levels, we're going to start to degrade these resources, and they're going to become net climate emitters, whereas now they're kind of net climate sinks. Each one is complicated, but that's the bottom line. Right now, they're preventing climate change. If they're degraded by higher temperatures, they're going to begin adding to climate change. It's going to make the problem much harder to solve. And unfortunately, if temperatures are allowed to get up to 2 degrees C, there are about a dozen more tipping points in the natural system that we know of. And not only will, of course, this risk climate change tipping points in these key global natural systems, but it's going to cause far more massive climate change impacts in the United States and around the world. Those climate change impacts are going to get much worse no matter what we do. If temperatures are allowed to rise above 1.5 C and to 2 C, I don't think we really have grappled with how massive the climate change impacts are going to be. Their economic consequences, their consequences on populations, forcing migration, agriculture, water. It's really difficult to comprehend how massive climate impacts will be if we allow temperatures to rise that fast. So it turns out that I'm not going to use that slide because you can't see all of it. But it turns out that the fastest way to reduce near-term temperatures is not to cut CO2, because CO2 stays in the atmosphere not only decades, but in fact centuries and millennia. The fastest way to reduce near-term temperatures is to cut short-lived climate pollutants, or so-called super pollutants. The principal super pollutants are methane, hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs, black carbon soot, and tropospheric ozone. And so if we're able to reduce these pollutants, these emissions quickly, we can reduce the rate of warming over the next quarter century by half. To put that in perspective, even large reductions in CO2 will probably only reduce near-term temperature increases by about half that amount that the super pollutants would. So it turns out that mitigating super pollutants is absolutely critical to climate protection. It's understandable that this issue has gotten lost because climate science is complicated. People understand now carbon dioxide and that it comes from fossil fuels. These other main greenhouse gases come from fossil fuels as well, but from other sources. And the good news is that they can be reduced quickly and cheaply. So HFCs are chemicals that are used in refrigeration and air conditioning. We already have a global agreement to phase out those chemicals by more than 80% before mid-century. By the way, that action alone is going to reduce temperatures 0.5 degrees Celsius from what they otherwise would be in this century. That shows how powerful reducing these super pollutants is in preventing runaway climate change. But we can accelerate the climate timetable for reducing HFCs under the Kigali Agreement. We can also improve the efficiency of cooling and air conditioning around the world and reduce emissions hugely of CO2. Turns out that the fastest growing demand, as one might expect in a warming world, for electricity is cooling. It's air conditioning and refrigeration. The second major super pollutant is black carbon soot. This is incompletely burned organic matter. It comes from dozens of sources. It comes from fossil fuels, but it also comes from land burning and brick kilns and diesel. This can be cut in huge amounts with the right technologies. For example, California has reduced black carbon soot 90%. And then the third primary super pollutant is methane. Methane comes from fossil fuels, but also from landfills, livestock, from natural systems, especially the melting of tundra. So it turns out that if we can mitigate these super pollutants quickly and cheaply over the next 20 years, we will reduce the rate of warming by about half and prevent temperatures from ever reaching 2C if we make large cuts in CO2 as well. So these may be the key to preventing the kind of runaway warming which the leading climate scientists around the world, I skipped over that chart, the leading climate scientists around the world are finding may tip these natural systems into runaway warming, in which reductions in CO2 will be far less effective. So I think it's important for viewers to understand that CO2 emissions are crucial to reduce, to prevent long-term climate runaway warming. But in the near term, the most important action in terms of reducing temperatures is these super pollutants. It's worth noting the Biden administration understands this. In fact, John Kerry was one of the key actors, along with Vice President Biden, in gaining the Kigali Agreement to cut HFCs. They are planning to, They have already talked about submitting the HFC treaty to the Senate for ratification. They're promulgating regulations to cut US HFCs and US methane emissions. But we need every country around the world to include these super pollutants in their Paris targets. And if we do that and we cut CO2, I believe we can prevent maybe 1.5C, but certainly 2C in temperature increases. And that may be the key to overall climate protection. So I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Paul, in particular for sharing the importance of the mitigation opportunity presented by super pollutants and how they, in a lot of cases, may present quicker opportunities to avoid the worst impacts of climate change than CO2 mitigation alone. And as you said, I'm very eager to discuss that in the Q&A as well, and remind everyone to drop your questions in there for the end. And so next I will pivot to Kevin Rennert from Resources for the Future. Hi, Kevin. Kevin joined RFF as a fellow in 2017 and directs RFF's Social Cost of Carbon Initiative, which is implementing the comprehensive set of recommendations by the National Academy of Sciences to improve estimates of the social cost of carbon. Prior to his arrival at RFF, Kevin served as Deputy Associate Administrator of the Office of Policy at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Leading up to his appointment at the Office of Policy, he worked as Senior Advisor on Energy for the Senate Finance Committee. In that role, Kevin advised the committee's chairman, Ron Wyden of Oregon, on a wide array of topics related to clean energy efficiency and policies to reduce greenhouse gas emission. Kevin led the development of the Clean Energy Standard Act of 2012, a presidential priority that would use market mechanisms to double the amount of electricity generated in the US from low or zero carbon sources by 2035. And we're very fortunate to have Kevin here to discuss valuing climate change damages and going into a deep dive on the social cost of carbon and its impact on policy analysis. So off to you, Kevin. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Paul. And thanks to everybody for being here, and to all the other panelists. It's really an honor to be sharing the virtual screen with all of you. So today I want to talk with all of you briefly about a concept called the social cost of carbon, which has a slightly different kind of take on the way to think about climate damages. And so first off, the question is, what is the social cost of carbon? And the social cost of carbon is the cost to society of adding 1 additional metric ton of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere in a particular year, expressed in US dollars. Or equivalently, you can flip it around and say that the SEC, as I'll refer to it throughout this talk, estimates the benefit of not emitting 1 ton of carbon dioxide. And ideally, this would encompass all of the kind of economic damages you could imagine. In practice, there is a more limited set. Some of those damages that are monetized within the models that calculate the SEC include changes in net agricultural productivity, changes in energy use, effects on human health, property damage from increased flood risk, and there are several others as well. I'm talking, to Paul's point earlier about other gases being important. When I speak about the social cost of carbon, I'm speaking relatively broadly, and when I don't say otherwise, I'm talking about the social cost of carbon dioxide specifically. But there are analogous metrics for methane, for nitrous oxide, and others that are in development as well. So the SEC is important for a number of reasons, but first and foremost, because it is incredibly influential, not just in US policymaking, but in policymaking around the world. So first of all, it's used in benefit cost analysis that the US federal government has been required to do since in the Reagan administration, and has been incorporating this kind of analysis since actually the tail end of the George W. Bush administration. It's used the SEC in this benefit cost analysis for over 150 proposed and finalized rules. It's also been used as the basis for setting the starting place for a federal carbon tax in legislation. Some states are using the social cost of carbon as the basis for making payments to clean energy generators like nuclear generators. Some states are requiring, as they plan for future additions of electric generation capacity onto their electric generation grid, they require that these utilities are submitting bids and plans that incorporates the social cost of carbon in their analysis. California requires the SEC for use in its policy analysis. Canada actually uses the US social cost of carbon methodology more or less. Mexico has agreed to take similar action. The German equivalent of our EPA uses the social cost of carbon, and on and on. So it's a very influential number. And even aside from all of these policymakers that are using this, businesses more and more are actually looking to understand their effects and value the effects of their decisions on climate change. And are taking the social cost of carbon into account in that as well. So this one number, or this one sort of set of numbers, is actually very influential, and any changes in that number that kind of get picked up have a chance to propagate throughout all of these different actors that I'm talking about here. And of course, one of the reasons we're talking about this today is that the main place that many of these actors look to understand the social cost of carbon and to adopt the values is the United States federal government. So what the US federal government does here is quite important. So just to hammer home how this value actually gets used, when we talk about benefit cost analysis, what actually goes on in the analysis of, say, a regulation that the EPA might put forward, or an energy efficiency standard or something like that, is that there is an analysis whereby they would calculate what the number of tons of avoided emissions would be of greenhouse gas emissions, and you multiply that expectation related to the regulation by the value of the social cost of carbon. So by doing that, you end up with a dollar value that represents the climate benefits that would be driven by that particular regulation. Now, these climate benefits are included in a broader benefit cost analysis that includes lots of other things. And so you might also have alongside the climate benefits, there would be implementation costs and jobs created or lost, as well as human health impacts from changes in air pollution that had nothing to do with climate change, but were unrelated in some other fashion. So the SCC in this fashion really is just looking to capture the costs and benefits of the effects on climate change, and it gets put alongside all of these other things that a policymaker is looking at when deciding what sort of a regulatory pathway or other policy pathway to pursue. So that's a very important kind of piece of how the SCC gets used. Now, estimating the SCC is actually a fairly technical and complicated process, but in general, it follows 4 basic steps. First, you're using something called an integrated assessment model that are a special type of economic model that also combines the climate system in it as well. And the first step of this is that you take projections of population, economic growth, and future emissions at the outset to have a sense of where the economy and the population and your overall kind of emissions are headed. The emissions then are fed into a climate model. The climate model translates that emissions pathway into changes in the climate system, variables like temperature, as well as sea level rise. Then the temperature change and sea level rise lead to damages, which are monetized and summed up. Now, these damages are occurring not just for 1 year, but persist into the future, and so you want to account for those future damages as well. And so you sum up all those damages into the future, and then economic discounting is used to sum those future damages into a single net present value today. Now, that same 4-step procedure is actually carried out twice to calculate the social cost of carbon, once with a baseline of emissions, and then again with a pulse of emissions on top of that baseline expectations for emissions. And by doing that, you can look at the difference in the damages that come out. And that difference is the social cost of carbon. It is the damages resulting from that additional ton of greenhouse gases. So you can see that these steps are kind of easy to spell out, but you can imagine that there is a lot of complexity behind the scenes. You're synthesizing across a huge amount of literature across multiple different academic disciplines. So there's really a lot to dig into to try to generate these estimates. And before, starting in roughly the 1990s, there were individual academics that were building models like this and estimating the SCC for their own purposes. But one of the most important things that the federal government has done here is to take the step of trying to aggregate some of this information and standardize it so that it is done in such a robust way that it would be sufficient for US regulatory analysis. And so this goes back to the start of the Obama administration when President Obama actually convened an interagency working group on the social cost of carbon, which I'll refer to as the IWG here, which looked at all of this and tried to come up with a methodology that would synthesize across all these different strands of literature that I mentioned. And the approach that they developed and issued the first estimates for the federal government in 2010 was to sample the 3 most cited models used for this in the academic literature. They harmonized them with a set of socioeconomic emission scenarios. They also harmonized them with a set of climate parameters as well. And then they did the analysis for 3 different constant discount rates, 2.5%, 3%, and 5%. Now I'll say more about that in just a moment. The important take home from this is that for all of the things that have happened over the last decade or so, this framework itself that was first, kind of finalized in 2010 and the first estimates that were issued under the Obama administration has really remained intact and almost not unchanged. They've updated the models in some cases to the newest versions. There have been some slight tweaks on a technical basis, but really this framework itself has been in place for the better part of a decade. I do want to dwell briefly on this concept of economic discounting because it is so influential in the case of the social cost of carbon. Now, broadly thinking, I think that the economic discount rate simply is a way of kind of representing the fact that $1 today is more valuable to you than $1 at some point in the future. And you can get very, very wonky on determining exactly what that economic discount rate should be. And there's a lot, certainly to that conversation. But in this case, you can also think about it as, if a damage were to happen today, that would feel, more important to you than a damage that might happen in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years or so on down the line. And the way that that gets represented in these integrated assessment models is through this economic discounting rate that is applied. And so you can think about it sort of as a way of dialing up or down how much the analysis actually accounts for the damages that are happening in the future. The damages themselves are continuing to aggregate up damages into the future, but at some point, if you're discounting them away, at a certain point, those damages don't really factor into that present day calculation. So I present, these sort of sets of discount rates just as kind of to give you a sense of just how influential that number is. These are effectively all the same runs for the social cost of carbon, just with different rates of economic discount applied. So this 3% rate is the central one that was used under the Obama administration, and that gives you a global SEC of about $51. There's also sensitivities around that number of 2.5% and 5%, where for a higher rate of discount of 5%, it actually drops from $51 down to $14. And even if you just drop it 0.5% down to 2.5%, you see that it goes from $51 up to $76. If you were to take this even further and look at a 1% discount rate, you see that your $51 is now actually $406. So the point of this is that relatively small changes in the discount rate actually can have an extremely outsized influence on the overall value of the social cost of carbon. So your decisions in applying that discount rate and your choice of that discount rate have a very important role to play in the ultimate number that comes out. So in 2017, the federal government had asked the National Academy of Sciences to consider what the federal government had been doing to generate the SEC and offer advice for what future estimates would look like, what the process would look like, what improvements could be made. And the National Academy of Sciences delivered in spades, gave about a 300-page document replete with recommendations on all these different fronts, saying, here on the socioeconomic projections, you're actually not spanning the right uncertainty on climate modeling. There are improvements to be made there to actually have climate models that are more reflective of the current state of the science. Same with damage calculations. The National Academy of Sciences panel noted that for estimates that were released in 2010, some of the modeling that it relied on actually relied on science for those damage functions that was dating back to the 1990s. So there was a lot of important work to be kept brought up to date there. And on the discounting front, that it would be very important to actually have the discounting itself account for uncertainty in economic growth as well. So a key recommendation as well is that the U.S. government establish a 5-year cycle for updating the estimates, so that there was sort of a continuous cycle of improvement of these numbers over time that stakeholders, businesses, everybody could effectively plan on. That would have the federal government putting out initial estimates, having a comment process, then having them go final, having further scientific feedback, and then the kind of process starting over again. So That set of recommendations was actually delivered to the Trump administration as the Trump administration came into office. And the Trump administration had a different take on the social cost of carbon. And relatively quickly after coming into office, President Trump issued Executive Order 13783, which took the step of disbanding this interagency working group on the social cost of greenhouse gases. It withdrew the previous social cost of carbon estimates, and it instructed agencies to develop new estimates that were focused only on domestic impacts, so those damages that were being felt within the United States borders, and using a different set of discount rates, using the 3% that was used before for the under the Obama administration, but also using a 7% discount rate, which obviously is much higher than what was being used under the Obama administration. The result of those simple changes, everything else was kept the same. The rest of the modeling framework didn't change at all. The resulting central estimates of the SEC that were used in regulatory analysis on the Trump administration were $7 per ton of carbon dioxide and $1 per ton of carbon dioxide, respectively. So it was a significant downward revision of the social cost of carbon estimates. So now we bring ourselves into the present, and the Biden administration is currently in its own, under its own power, looking to update the SEC. And what's on Inauguration Day, actually, one of the first things that President Biden did was sign Executive Order 13990, which reestablished the Interagency Working Group on the social cost of greenhouse gases and gave it a couple of tasks. The first was to develop an interim estimate that was just released actually this past February, and also to proceed on a pretty expeditious timeline to update the SEC estimates by January of next year, incorporating the recommendations of the National Academy of Sciences panel. And there's a lot that's going to go into that process. Obviously, there are technical working groups that are being stood up right now. This entire interagency working group is moving, but is still kind of getting its legs under it, I would say. And so it's hard to say exactly where the final estimates are going to end up. But the Biden administration has already done a lot of signaling as to the things that the Biden administration thinks are important. And they did that in the context of the interim estimates that were put out this past February. The interim estimates of the social cost of carbon that are in use right now actually just take the step of reverting back to the previous estimates of the Obama administration for the social cost of carbon dioxide, the social cost of methane, the social cost of nitrous oxide, just adjusting them for inflation over time. But within that technical support document that accompanied those the interim estimates, there was a lot of signaling that happened in that there was strong signaling of support for a global perspective in the social cost of carbon estimation, as opposed to the domestic perspective that was adopted by the Trump administration. A usage of the consumption rate of discount as being the appropriate rate of discount to be looking at. This is effectively the discount rate that you or I would think about as private citizens, as opposed to the discount rate that a private firm would consider. And on top of that, that discount rate, the consumption rate of discount rate itself, there was a lot of indication that current data and evidence would indicate that for intergenerational problems like the social cost of carbon, that rate itself should be revised downwards as well. So that 3% that was used as the central value would be considered, is likely to be considered too high based on the current state of economics and the market conditions. There's also an additional kind of notation that the current SEC models that are used by the government are missing a number of damage categories, and also are just behind the state of the science, kind of along the lines of what the National Academy of Sciences was reporting as well. So we at RFF have, since 2017, have actually been engaged in implementing these National Academy of Sciences recommendations. We have a sort of multi-institution collaboration going on, and our objectives have really been to implement these recommendations of the National Academy of Sciences, to kind of transparently update the SEC. And part of that has been to develop open source software tools, meaning making it very easy for the scientific community, for the public, for everyone to be able to engage in this process and see exactly what's going into this estimate, so that there's tons of transparency when it comes to the actual decisions that are being made for estimating the social cost of carbon. And finally, the goal is really to facilitate this entire update that's in process right now. So with that, I invite you to check out our website. It's rff.org/SEC, and I look forward very much to the conversation. Thank you.
Great, and thank you, Kevin, for the the examination of the wide reach of the social cost of carbon, your great specifics on its application and calculation, and also what sounds like its current regulatory journey. We're eager to see that follow through, and it's obvious that our participants are also interested in that because we got a couple of great questions in the Q&A that I hope we can get to in a few. Thank you. First, though, we're going to pivot to Mary Boyer. Mary, can you join us? Of the World Bank. Hi. Mary Boyer is a disaster risk management specialist who joined the World Bank in 2015. She leads a disaster risk financing technical assistance for Caribbean countries that focuses on building capacity within ministries of finance and relative entities towards the goal of developing national strategies for disaster risk financing and cost-effective approaches to disaster response as part of a comprehensive approach to disaster risk management. Prior to the bank, she supported the development of the inaugural risk pool of African risk capacity, a parametric drought risk insurance product developed by a specialized agency of the African Union. She has also managed community-driven disaster risk management projects through interagency and stabilization programming in Afghanistan with US aid. And Mary is going to discuss the understanding and paying for hazard risk in the Caribbean and give us a local lens to a lot of the big picture discussions we've been having so far. So with that, I'll pass it to you, Mary. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul, for the introduction. Really grateful to be a part of this very distinguished panel, and thank you all for joining. I'm going to share my screen now. Okay. So assuming you can all see my PowerPoint. Thanks. As Paul mentioned, I will be presenting kind of a small piece of this overall big puzzle, and that is supporting countries in developing cost-effective strategies to manage the impacts of ongoing hazard events. So perhaps to think of it as well, the other panelists, Paul, Helen, and Kevin, are measuring and reporting on and helping countries and governments develop strategies to mitigate the impacts of climate change. My team at the bank and other disasters management teams at the bank are really supporting countries in dealing with the immediate impacts of the ongoing natural hazards that are often occurring with increasing climate change impacts. And so this slide is perhaps an oversimplification, but showing you a bit where I'm coming from to make sure we're all on the same page. I'm focusing on the gray circle. And so much of the work that we do is so interconnected with climate change. As you well know, events are expected to increase in frequency and severity. There's only a small portion of natural hazards that are not really that inextricably linked to climate change, like geophysical events like earthquakes or the current volcanic eruption happening in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. But nonetheless, countries are really experiencing these fast onset events, and our role as disaster risk managers is to help them first stop these natural hazards from becoming disasters. Building up resilience in infrastructure, systems, et cetera, can support countries really face the ongoing impact from climate change. And further drilling down, in terms of the key pillars of disaster risk management, that are identifying and understanding the risk from hazards, reducing that risk, and then preparing for that risk through having operationalization of plans and immediate response early warning systems, and also, of course, engaging in sustainable and resilient post-disaster reconstruction. There's also financial protection. So if we talk about disaster risk management as stopping natural hazards from becoming disasters, we can talk about financial protection or disaster risk financing as preventing these disasters from turning into economic shocks. And that's important because countries, especially those in the Caribbean, have very limited fiscal space. Most of them have already identified a climate change strategy with ongoing development projects and programs to carry out that strategy, and disasters will take away financing from that and derail development efforts. So again, further drilling down into the Caribbean, Disasters have been costly in the Caribbean, and they've been slowly increasing over the last 30 years and 40 years. This graph doesn't do a great job of showing exactly how they've been increasing, but it really demonstrates that in the last 30 years, 40 years, there have been almost 20, this graph doesn't even include Dorian in 2018, but there have been numerous events that have caused damage of over 50% of a country's GDP in the Caribbean. This is enormous. Thinking about an event like the hurricanes that we've been experiencing in the United States is less than a percentage of our GDP. And so these disasters in the Caribbean have been destabilizing. And now almost every year, my team can expect to respond to at least one. So how do countries deal with these disasters? First, we think about really devastating events like Hurricane Maria that slammed into Dominica in September 2017, caused direct damages of 225% of the country's GDP. It's almost unthinkable. Fortunately, Dominica had in place a few immediate instruments to respond, such as the parametric risk transfer product through CRIF that I'll explain later. But it was also a wake-up call to Dominica that they also didn't really have a plan in place for damage and loss assessment, for preparing for the next disaster, and making sure that they had financial instruments that could increase their preparedness. But then there are also lots of events that are a bit more frequent, less severe, like local annualized flooding that nonetheless will impact a country's budget and spending and can be somewhat predicted. And so how can a country also manage financially these kind of events through perhaps holding their own reserves as annual events of this nature might not be cost effective to cover through insurance. But this can also inform, if we understand how much the country has been spending on flooding, this can inform hazard resilient investment spending, meaning if the country is tracking that they are consistently experiencing hazards along this road, they should invest in more resilient transportation infrastructure. So the way we do this strategically with countries is to help them think through a comprehensive approach to disaster risk financing. The key elements of it are the blue, which highlight some of the instruments that we the financial instruments that we talk to countries about using. Contingency reserves, contingent financing arrangements with international partners, meaning a loan that they can quickly draw down on, or a grant, disaster insurance, and also working with the private sector to ensure that insurance solutions are cost effective for the public and private sector companies. But then these instruments, they're not going to be effective if you can't think strategically and make data-driven decisions on their size based on quantifying the risk that you have in your country from various natural hazards. So we also work to improve data coordination and management to better understand that risk. And so engaging with hazard risk profiles, understanding their uses, creating an inventory of public assets so we can better understand exactly what capital assets are at risk by understanding their replacement values and their geolocation, streamlining damage and loss data collection. It's really become more of a trend that it's quite easy to engage the international community for a large scale event and have the World Bank, WHO, the IMF, the UN system engage in damage and loss data collections through post-disaster needs assessments, but countries also need to be able to undertake that process domestically to capture loss and damage from the less severe events. And then of course, the instruments also don't mean much if you can't get it to where it's needed to be quickly and traceably through improving public financial management. So first, adopting a national strategy for disaster risk financing, creating that enabling policy environment that can mandate that some of these practices and policies are taken on. And then of course, streamlining reporting of post-disaster expenditures to better understand how money is spent, how exactly disasters have been impacting your national budget. And we help countries visualize this through a risk layering approach. in terms of how they can use and selectively access their instruments. And so starting at the bottom to look at more of the instruments available for high frequency, low severity events, you got budgetary reallocation. We try to discourage it, but sometimes it makes sense for these low scale events. Might just need to move some money around for response. But again, as we talked about before, it could also detract from ongoing development efforts and climate mitigation efforts. And then we advise the countries typically have a national disaster fund in place. And this is where risk metrics come into place, because you don't want the fund to be too big, or else there's some opportunity cost in taking money away from development priorities. And so we usually advise this fund is about the size of a country's average annual loss from prominent hazards. If we look at the Caribbean, typically that loss on average is about 1 or 2% of GDP. So the fund doesn't need to be that big, but it needs to be there for quick liquidity post-disaster. Then we have other instruments like contingent lines of credit. The World Bank offers a CAT DDO, Catastrophe Deferred Drawdown option in their loans. The Inter-American Development Bank offers options, and several bilateral donors do as well. And then, of course, there's post-disaster indebtedness that countries will always have to likely take on for more larger scale reconstruction projects. Those are risk retention instruments, meaning the country retains the risk. And then the green level is more risk transfer instruments or insurance instruments where risk can be transferred out of the country into international markets. And I'll talk about the first block a bit more, the public risk transfer or sovereign risk transfer through parametric insurance options. And then public risk transfer through indemnity coverage for public assets, meaning critical assets like your water systems, your solid waste management systems, electricity systems, and distribution transmission lines should be insured to think about how they can quickly bounce back and maintain government continuity in operations. And then, of course, addressing private households and private companies and vulnerable populations, ensuring that there is catastrophe insurance available for coverage of private property. And that goes back to relationships with domestic insurance sector. So as I mentioned, I'll be drilling down onto these risk pools. And there are 4, perhaps 5, but I'll talk about the main 4 globally. And to step back a little bit, sovereign catastrophe risk pools are often based on a parametric insurance approach. And parametric insurance is, in contrary to indemnity insurance, where your actual losses have to be assessed to receive a payout. Parametric insurance can distribute a payout when it's triggered by a weather event or other measurable type of event, such as wind speed, rainfall, ground movement. Some products are being developed for drop in tourism arrivals at ports. If you can quantify the risk and develop a trigger for it, you can insure against it. But the 4 most popular and largest risk pools internationally are the CRIF SPC in the Caribbean. That has the bread and butter are its tropical cyclone or hurricane policies, earthquake and excess rainfall policies. They also have policies to protect or help fisher folk protect against impacts on the fishing sector. They have a livelihood protection policy that can support individuals of any occupation with livelihood protection. Then African Risk Capacity supports the continent of Africa with customized drought insurance, and they've also expanded into tropical cyclone insurance as well, in addition to endemic and pandemic insurance, largely as a response to the Ebola crisis. And then there's CDRIF in Southeast Asia that focuses primarily on flood insurance and technical assistance. And then there's PCRFE for the Pacific Islands that focuses, again, mostly on tropical cyclone insurance. So why join a risk pool? As I mentioned before, this is a way to transfer risk to the private sector. Like any insurance, it's helpful to not retain all the risk and not be completely responsible for your car breaking down or getting into an accident. You can rely that you will know you'll have some income coming in if an unfortunate event happens. Also, working together allows for significant cost reduction in coverage and reduces transaction costs. This is one of the biggest things, the biggest reasons to join a risk pool. If each Caribbean country went individually to the international market and says, hey, I'd like some insurance coverage, they would have to first develop a model, then pay for that model, and then go back and forth with negotiations about policies and pricing. And so banding together and approaching an underwriter will really reduce those transaction costs, because that then reduces the transaction costs or rather the price of reinsurance that the underwriter would have to buy. It's also a type of expenditure smoothing for the government. If the government knows they have to spend $100,000 a year on insurance, it's a lot easier to swallow than from a budgetary planning perspective than having these interruptions every 5 years where they have to, spend 20 million on disaster response when they could instead be receiving that as a payout. It's immediate liquidity post-disaster. Also, there's lots of studies about how having access to immediate liquidity and being able to take on those necessary response actions sooner rather than later can also reduce the future losses from that, in terms of having access. For example, being able to quickly get your health system back up and running and your water systems decrease the chances that there's a future secondary disaster like a cholera outbreak. Parametric triggers can complement other triggers for contingent financing. As I mentioned, parametric triggers are pretty, we call them hard triggers, meaning that there's not really any wiggle room around the wind speed, rainfall, or ground movement calculated. And so you may receive a payout, you may not. And there's a basis risk included in that, which means you might experience a loss and not receive a payout if the trigger wasn't met. And so we advise that you also look at other contingent financing that can perhaps pay out upon declaration of a national emergency or something like that. So it's the choice of the government to draw it down. Coverage is customizable also based on the country's risk appetite. You can choose to cover a lot of your risk or not a lot of your risk based on your appetite and your budget. And then very important is that it comes with increased technical assistance and risk information. To build a risk pool, each country needs essentially a risk profile. And so you have built for you a customized quantification of your risks and technical assistance to help you understand what that risk profile is and how to make decisions on it. So lastly, I'll talk about the positive externalities of risk pools. So it really fosters internal government policy dialogue on risk management and risk ownership. A lot of these policies are sovereign policies, meaning the government, the central government might, usually through the Ministry of Finance, purchase this policy, but then how do you make decisions on how to use a payout? So that means engaging your line ministries to understand who exactly should be the first beneficiary of one of these payouts and who's responsible for what risks within the government. It also maximizes the impact of post-disaster funds by developing response plans. 3 of the risk pools globally require that countries must have in place an operation plan for use of payouts post-disaster to ensure that they're used effectively. This is often a donor requirement as well to ensure that the funds can be traced. CRIF, on the other hand, does not require this operational plan. But if you have to, as a government, sit down and say, here's how we're going to use these funds, and here's exactly what programs they will support, how we can scale up social protection systems, et cetera, it really helps encourage better and more efficient use of these funds. They also create public literacy by improving that, or rather public goods by improving literacy about insurance. I can say 10 years ago, the Caribbean really didn't understand a lot about what parametric insurance was. And now every country is saying, well, let's develop since COVID, let's develop a policy for tourism arrivals. Let's develop a policy for I don't know, for farmers. And so it's really exciting to see that Caribbean countries have really taken on how to develop these innovative products. As I mentioned before, it strengthens institutional capacity and policy dialogue. and increases availability of disaster risk models. It's cost effective as well. Parametric insurance is much cheaper than indemnity insurance and much quicker for payout. There's no loss adjuster that has to come and survey the loss, make a report, file a claim. If you experience a natural hazard that meets the trigger, you get the money within a week. It's pretty simple. And rates online, meaning the actual rate of the premium compared to overall payout is also much cheaper because of those cost savings from the no need for a loss adjuster. And finally, the point I'll stop on is that it facilitates a shift towards proactive risk management. As I mentioned before, if a country is experiencing these ongoing hazards and purchasing insurance for those hazards, they're going to realize that it's not cost effective in the long run to continue to purchase insurance when they could instead be investing in risk reduction on a physical risk reduction side. And so it really encourages governments to think about how they can be reducing their physical risk to climate impacts. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary, for sharing the bank's disaster risk management capacities and their connection to climate change, and also a lot of really interesting detail on the instruments necessary to make climate disaster funding possible, including risk pools. We got a couple of questions about that as well, and I hope we can get into that deeper. And in fact, we're done with our speakers, and so I'd like to pivot to our Q&A period. If all of our panelists would join us by video and audio. Thank you very much. This is just a remarkable collection of expertise on these issues, and the questions that we got really reflect that. I'm going to start with one that is sort of a big picture question that wasn't addressed directly by anyone specifically, and that's that a recent Swiss Re study estimated that falling short of the 2-degree Paris scenario goal will cost nations 11 to 14% per year in world economic output by 2050. And I wonder, is this consistent? This was just in the New York Times today. And wonder, is this consistent with what the panelists' understanding is? Economists like Nordhaus estimated a few years ago that keeping climate change to a manageable level would cost 1.5 to 2% of the world's GDP as well. So again, I'm curious about whether you feel like these numbers are consistent with your thoughts, and can this kind of calculation be helpful in getting people and governments and the private sector to buy in to the importance of climate mitigation? Any thoughts on that?
I'd jump in quickly, Paul. This is Paul Bledsoe. We're already seeing incredible costs of climate change for all sorts of entities around the world, including US taxpayers. In 2017, for events that happened in 2017 alone, the Congress, which was Republican at that point, appropriated $130 billion for emergency aid for weather disasters related to climate change. Let me put that in perspective. $130 billion is a quarter of the non-defense discretionary budget of the United States that year, 25% of the non-defense discretionary budget. We are hiding all of these costs right now through a whole host of systems that Mary referred to, that Helen was actually discussing, that Kevin's social cost of carbon will reveal. We are hiding these costs right now. That appropriation I mentioned is off budget. We don't have to raise taxes to pay for it. It's hidden from most taxpayers. So there are a whole variety of ways that we are hiding costs that are enormous and are about to get much larger.
Thanks, Paul. Helen, I saw you were interested in answering as well.
Yes, I mean, just really to build a little bit on what Paul said, I mean, we are seeing these impacts already. Unfortunately, a lot of our accounting systems, our economic systems, our models, our projections for the future are really bad at actually estimating them or including them. So we have had some fantastic work, including, I think, the Swiss Re study, where you're starting to look at what does this actually add up to. We've seen some analyses of specific events, extreme weather events and how that's hit the US or other countries around the world, how that adds up. But I think one of our challenges is these aren't being yet integrated properly into the standard economic models. And that's why some of the work we've been doing to help support the Indonesian Ministry of Planning, but also in Colombia to help the government there, in Ethiopia, and a number of other countries, is actually about adjusting our standard economic accounting and modeling systems to reflect some of these costs: resource depletion, air pollution, health impacts, all of these things. We don't even cover all of them, but once you start to add them in, you actually see that a different pathway is going to be better for us economically, for jobs, for health, those benefits. So that's where you see that divergence. The sad thing is, I do think it's important to get these numbers out and to get them public. It wakes people up. They start to realize. The sad thing is we've got a very high bar in place in terms of actually then activating climate policy and action. In most cases, just knowing about the risks is not going to be enough to scare people to move. They also need to know, how do we move forward? And can you show us that we'll actually have benefits from moving forward? We can, and increasingly we're seeing that in President Biden's plan today, and what he's put forward in terms of the American Jobs Plan and the infrastructure investment really shows those benefits. But it's a high bar, and I do wonder if in other areas of public policy we would wait till we met that bar to be actually taking the kind of action we're seeing today.
Yeah, no, communicating costs and benefits are always important with public policy, especially as far-reaching as what we're suggesting here.
I just one brief
Sure.
addendum to that I agree that having all this analysis in the hands of the public is pretty vital to helping people to understand the risks that are being faced. And one of the challenges that I've seen with some of the different studies that are out there have been that they actually provide a pretty diverse view of, like, they all say, there are definitely damages coming, but sometimes there can be a wide sway in terms of how much that cost is. And so one of the things that we've been trying to do to build kind of transparency in this is to try to get all this on a single platform so that people can understand where those changes in the estimates are coming from, so that they can then improve models where they're deficient and just kind of have faith in what it says at the end.
Thanks for that. Pivoting, we got a question based on Mary's presentation about risk pools, and specifically what countries have joined these kind of risk pools, and maybe is there any way you can generalize about what makes a country more or less likely to be willing to take that approach?
So in terms of generally, I think it's countries who have ministers of finance who are willing to invest in these type of innovative products. It really requires a lot of forward thinking and regional cooperation. And it's typically countries that have some kind of catalyzing regional event or really prominent regional institution. For example, in the Caribbean, there's CARICOM. In Africa, there was the African Union, a Pan-Africa effort that Ngozi led, Minister of Finance of Nigeria, about a decade ago. And so that was a really catalyzing event and movement for African countries to join African risk capacity. And even if they didn't buy a product, they still, as a member, were receiving technical assistance, were receiving information on risk, and then they could choose to buy a product. And so I'd say the most successful examples have been in the Caribbean, with a really strong regional institution, set of regional institutions, as well as Africa. And PCRFE and CDRIF, they're still learning, but they lack some of the existing really close-knit regional institutions.
Thanks. We have a question here as well for Kevin we have a couple relating to the social cost of carbon. I'll pick out one, which is there a socially optimal discount rate based on your work? And specifically, this person says, I'm thinking of it in terms of consumer and producer surplus and deadweight loss. Which rate provides the best welfare gain and is more economically attractive to those who stand to lose the most?
Thanks. So the way that this kind of gets thought about in the SEC conversation is really, and then NAS recommended that we move in this direction, is to think about it in kind of a Ramsey framework, where you split the kind of economic discount rate into two pieces. One is called a pure rate of time preference, how much you care about just something happening now versus later, and then also something that effectively relates to the fact that as people have more money, they actually care less about additional damages. You need to think about both of those. And so the focus isn't really on optimizing around those, rather than trying to determine, what should those parameters actually be in this model. And the evidence from economists right now has been pointing very strongly in the direction that where they have been previously, sort of no matter how you look at it, whether you think about that from just sort of a values-based perspective, or you think about that empirically based on data that have come out, is that those numbers actually are just too high in previous covenant analysis, and that they need to be thought of as a lower number, which effectively puts greater weight on future generations than was previously considered in these estimates.
Thank you. I have a question here that I think it'd be best answered by Helen. This is based on your net zero target slides, and it asks, why are there a few outliers with countries like Russia, Mexico, and the Philippines moving away from these goals, while the majority of countries shown, that is the United States, China, and Canada, et cetera, are moving towards more green statistics?
That is a very good question. And if we can work this out, we've actually solved all the problems. To be frank, some of those countries, I mean, if I take the Philippines, they've actually come forward recently with some fairly ambitious commitments in terms of phasing out coal. So there's some progress in different places. We do have a number of what we'd call laggards, real laggards on climate, which are going backwards. Both Mexico and Brazil presented new 2030 updated NDCs, climate plans, which, because of changes in the base years, actually meant they went backwards from where they were 5 years ago at the time of the Paris Agreement. So we definitely have some laggards here. I think a lot of this, it gets back to what we were discussing before, where there's more and more evidence in front of us, but you either get people who do not understand the science and see the connections between what's happening on the planet and climate science, so they're not actually willing to accept those connections despite what all the scientists say, or you have still economic models and systems which are telling them differently. They're telling them that investing in climate action is going to lead to costs. It's going to be expensive to the economy. They're going to lose competitiveness. All the more modern and the newer economic analyses, all of the pure economic theory tells us that's not the case. Now, we now have tools that are also showing that that's not the case, but the traditional tools have not been able to account for the kinds of externalities we're talking about here, and so therefore have come out with numbers that were wrong, and all economists using them would say, well, we know this probably isn't right, but this is the best we have. So they're relying on tools and information that's outdated. And then the third, I would say, is, I mean, pure politics, right? I mean, who's got power? Who's got influence? It's often those incumbent industries that have been around for a long time, those who've been investing in those and want to keep them going, right? And those are often those fossil fuel-based companies, those who benefit from this. So you've got all these new sectors emerging. These are the sectors of the future, but right now they're small in some cases, or they're starting to build up their power and their capacity and their ability to do things like lobby. They're not there yet. So that's why also last year we saw with the COVID response, the immediate response on bailout of companies was fossil fuel companies, aviation companies. These were the things that everyone, that leapt to the table, got the money in the first round, and then went back and often didn't use it to actually invest in their staff. They used it to keep their heads afloat themselves. So I would say those are the reasons. We are at a point where things are shifting significantly. I think with the U.S. administration, new U.S. administration, the clear signal from American voters that they see that climate action is needed. They are supporting the approaches going forward. I think with the U.S. shifting, that actually shifts a lot in terms of global power. I think China's shifting. China is stepping up a lot. I mean, things are shifting. I'm hoping that these laggards will become fewer, far between, and eventually, actually, we just won't even notice them anymore.
I was just going to jump in quickly. I agree with everything that Helen said. I wanted to talk about Russia. Russia is the fourth largest emitter in the world. its emissions are rising essentially faster than anybody else's relative to the size of its economy. Not only that, but Putin has designs to turn the Arctic into his personal oil and gas field. As I mentioned before, the melting of Arctic sea ice is a tipping point. It's probably the most near-term tipping point that could prevent the stabilization of sea ice. And the main forcer of Arctic sea ice melt is actually not CO2, it's black carbon. And so we have specific resources that are threatened by specific countries. Arctic and Russia are a key case in point. Brazil and the Amazon is another case in point. We need to have very special focus on those countries and those resources, or a lot of what we do is not going to matter.
Thanks for that, Paul. We have plenty of other really good questions in the queue, but we've come to the bottom of the hour, unfortunately. And I just want to thank Helen, Paul, Kevin, and Mary for your time, and for the American University School of Public Affairs and the Center for Environmental Policy for bringing this really excellent group together. And we look forward to the next panel, which Todd, I think, is going to fill us in on here. Oh, you're muted, Todd.
You'd think after a year of teaching like this, I would learn. But anyway, thank you all very much. Thank you, Paul. It was a wonderful panel and opportunity. And the next of these panels will be on May 13th from 5:30 to 7 p.m. Eastern time. We will be talking about the role of the private sector a bit more explicitly. The title of the webinar will be Updating Old Actors and Introducing New Ones in the Race to Carbon Neutrality. So we just want to wish everyone a happy Earth Day, and to tell you that the recording of this webinar will be available within a few days. And we appreciate very much all of your presence here, and thank you. Have a great Earth Day, and let's hope that we get a lot more accomplishments from this summit today. Thanks.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.